Okay, so if people could come on in and sit down, we're going to begin our keynote lunch talk. This is going to be a case study on distributed systems for clinical research information sharing. We're going to have Dr. Richard Platt address us, and then we have some time for conversation, discussion, etc. Dr. Platt's a professor and chair of the Department of Population Medicine and executive director of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. He's an internist trained in infectious diseases and epidemiology, and he's focusing in his research on multi-institution automated record linkage systems for use in pharmacoepidemiology and population-based surveillance. He's had experiences essentially with every federal agency involved in health, I do believe. So I'm not going to go through all those. They're in your packets. Welcome, Richard.
Okay, thanks very much. So I would posit that just as none of us really cares about good health care except as a way to getting to good health, we don't really care about data sharing so much as we care about information sharing. So what I'd like to talk with you about in the next few minutes is to what extent can we share information while minimizing the amount of data that we have to share? Well, why not share information? We've already talked about, this is a much more condensed list than the one that we've already developed this morning. I would say that on the privacy side, personally, I am a relatively conservative in my beliefs about whether it's possible to de-identify data, but certainly to the extent that we're successful in de-identifying data, it becomes less rich and less useful. For instance, if you say we'll only identify someone at the level of country, that means that you can't ask questions about using census data to geocoded data to do a variety of kinds of mapping. We haven't really talked much about the potential risks of inadvertent disclosure when data is shared, but it to my mind, is a very important one. My colleague Mary Durham likens data that's shared under various confidentiality provisions to hazardous waste, saying once you have it, you then have to be a good custodian of it forever. Now, she and I differ on whether it's like radioactive waste or like biohazard waste. I think it's more like biohazard waste because it can multiply. You can say, that's okay. We have mechanisms for dealing with pathogens, and that's certainly true. With a sufficient amount of effort, you can keep control of it, except when it gets loose. And then you need Morgan Freeman to bail you out. And how many Morgan Freemans are there? Why else? If those reasons for sharing data haven't given you pause, you should certainly be concerned about the threat to litigation that you might expose yourself to by receiving the data. You can say, Rich, you're just being paranoid. And I'll say you're only paranoid if they're not really after you. This is a subpoena that my organization received in February asking for a very large amount of data. It's not the first time we've been subpoenaed, and although it was quashed, it was a fair amount of effort for the legal team of a large number of organizations to respond to this kind of subpoena. And I have to tell you that in this case, we were using information that came from healthcare systems, and it's always a problem if I show up on the CEO's doorstep to say, don't worry about the subpoena that we just received for your data. So that leads to my second law of collaboration, which is don't take possession of somebody else's data if a third party might want to subpoena it. So what's the alternative? The alternative is the approach that the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technologies has promulgated for sharing of clinical information. And that is to say, this is the Query Health Initiative. It's separate from the meaningful use exchange of patient-level information and is intended to support essentially the learning healthcare system, the informed secondary use of electronic health data that's supposed to transform our ability to learn what works and what doesn't work and assess quality. So this is Farzad Mostashari, who says the mantra should be send the question to the data rather than bring the data to the question. And so I'd like to expand on that theme and think about ways in which we might do that. Well, first of all, what do we mean by the question? Question in this sense is an executable program that can be sent from the originator to the holder of data, and that program can operate on a remote data set without being translated into a local form. So how might that work? Well, the easiest way, this is the way we did it originally, was to have the authorized user write the program, and then we'd email it, or we'd send it on a disk, or sometimes we'd use SneakerNet. And then the person who has the data would run the program and send the results back in the same way. If you need to do a single kind of exchange, that works, but it's very cumbersome to do that. A second way would be to say, let's give you direct access, and you can log into our system and do the analyses. That also works. It means having to first of all create the right kinds of access through a firewall, which many organizations are hesitant to do, but you can do that. But in a more advanced form, you'd want to build a whole bunch of protections into it. You'd like to know that an IRB has been involved. You'd like a portal that can handle a lot of network management kinds of functions. I won't read them all. And then you'd like local controls, so you know who's coming in to ask the question and what kind of question it is. And you'd like to be able to understand whether or not you're prepared to respond to the specific question. But if you could set up a system like this, you could also set up a multi-site system where you had research data from several different organizations behind several different firewalls, and a single question could come from a portal and be distributed to all these sites, and results could come back. And you might say, if I have a sufficiently rich data set, I'll be prepared to create project-specific data to support a specific inquiry from someone with whom I'm prepared to collaborate. A sufficiently rich data set would be one that has many patient-level identifiers, for instance, and it might only be necessary to expose to a remote investigator a small fraction of that information. Now, since I'm mostly not a trialist, this is the way I think of trialists. They're smart, they're elegant, they move well.
It's all true.
And it's all true. It's all true. But speaking for the community that uses observational data, I have to think the way Ginger Rogers did, to say, when you're using observational data, you have to do it sort of backwards and on high heels. Because the data is derived from source data that usually comes someplace else and was not collected under protocol, but was collected as part of the routine delivery of healthcare. And so a fully implemented distributed system might be one that uses clinical data even for clinical trials, might start with the EHRs, that's part of what we heard about this morning, and be supplemented with research data, and then spin off project data and be accessible through a sufficiently robust system that allows queries to be originated and authenticated and authorized, and then can take results back and aggregate them. Well, does something like this exist? I have to apologize. We've been going from right to left all this time, and now you have to go from left to right. This is an example of the reference software that Query Health uses for what's called its policy implementation layer. My group built this, but we didn't know it was a policy implementation layer until Query Health told us that. But you can see on the left there is a cloud-based system for having people with various kinds of authorizations submit queries which can be authenticated in a variety of ways, and they're transferred over to a data mart client which lives with the organization that has data, and that can relay the queries to a data source, and then the results can come back. So the worked example is work that my colleagues and I are doing with the Food and Drug Administration to build a post-marketing medical product safety surveillance system. It's called Mini Sentinel. Mini-Sentinel has 30 organizations that are participating in it. The ones above the line are data partners. There are 17 separate installations that have data that has been acquired during the course of routine patient care, and they're all participating in this work. The Mini-Sentinel distributed database has data now on just over 125 million people, 3 billion dispensings, 2.4 billion unique encounters. So there's a lot of data that's been put into a common data model. Each organization has transformed its data into exactly the same format, so it's possible when you send a program to have that program operate on the data. I was asked to say something about how does that happen, and the answer is it's a simple 8-step process. But I'll just point out to you that if you look here and here, there are these little circles, which means it's an iterative process that we go through, and we do about 400 data checks now on the data, and if the data doesn't check properly, then it has to go back again. So it's not a small process to do this this conversion into common data model format. And the large data partners do this every 3 months or so. So it's an ongoing activity to create this resource. Having created it, it's then accessible to a distributed data system. Which so here's the cartoon version showing one data partner, another data partner. There's 17 of them. There's a portal. The queries come out. There's a firewall. The data partner has a choice. The data partner can stop every query that comes in and examine the code before allowing it to execute. And the data partner can stop every result before it comes back and inspect that result before returning it to the coordinating center. On the other hand, they can set the permissions so that one or both of those runs automatically, and depending on the kind of query, they sometimes do one or the other of them. By and large, what comes back is aggregated results. That is, it's counts or frequencies or rates. Doesn't have to be, but by and large it is. And although this runs as this is a public health surveillance activity, it conforms with the HIPAA provisions for public health, not for research, and the common rule covering research doesn't apply. Nonetheless, we work hard to minimize the amount of person-level data that's transferred. So almost all the heavy lifting that involves patient-level data is done here behind the firewall of the organization that has the data as part of its regular operations. So here, I'll show you briefly an example of the kind of work that can be done with a distributed system, because I know you're saying, for all that work, nothing substitutes for having the data in front of me and being able to manipulate it and look at the results and being able to use it. As an investigator, it's very hard. Your initial sense is it's very hard to work by remote control. So here's work that we recently completed with FDA, looking at angioedema related to drugs that target the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is work that's going to be published in a couple of weeks. So I'm not going to show you the results, but I'll just show you how we set things up and how we did the analyses as an example. This looks like a regular research project because it has a big research team that was involved in it. The question was, are ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, or aliskiren associated with similar or different risks of angioedema compared with beta blockers, which is the referent group? We defined a cohort as individuals who were at least 18, who had a first treatment with one of the drugs in this class. If you've already been treated with another drug in the class, you're not eligible. The index date is the first dispensing, and the additional eligibility criteria are here, which is we have to know something about your history. We have to know that you haven't had angioedema in the past 6 months. We have to know that you haven't had any of these other drugs of interest. We have to know that you aren't getting 2 of these drugs, which means we have to be confident we know what your medical history's been for the past 6 months, which means we have to be confident we know essentially all the medically attended care you've received. primary outcome is angioedema, which turns out angioedema is a condition for which a coded diagnosis in a claims file turns out to have a very high positive predictive value. For this condition, it's not necessary to do chart reviews to review them. And the secondary outcome is serious angioedema, airway obstruction, hospitalization. You can see the additional criteria here. So here's the schematic for for the study design, at least 6 months during which we know various things are or are not true, and then you're observed until the date of first angioedema or the end of the study period or these various termination events occur. So you can tell we're getting ready to do an analysis that's sensitive to person time. There are a bunch of confounders. These are the ones that we controlled for. And the analysis includes a descriptive analysis, regular old baseline characteristics, unadjusted and adjusted, and then pairwise comparisons to beta blockers, adjusted by site, propensity score adjusted hazard ratios, and then a case-centered logistic regression model was the primary analysis and an inverse variance weighted meta-analysis. I've asterisked this case-centered logistic regression model because it's an analytic technique that Bruce Fireman at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, developed in part to minimize the need for moving patient-level data around. One of the things that's become increasingly clear to us during the several years we've been doing this work is if you ask sufficiently thoughtful statisticians and epidemiologic methodologists to develop new methods that can work in a distributed fashion, they can be remarkably creative. So while not every analysis that one might want to do is amenable to distributed analysis, an increasing number are, and I think there's a substantial amount of room that we could still move in that arena. Secondary and sensitivity analyses, so we're doing stratified subgroup analyses, sensitivity analyses, changing the look-back period, restricting to inpatient and ED diagnoses, restricting to the date after the most recent of these compounds was approved. So the point I'm trying to make here is these are the kinds of analyses that we think of as being part of good data analysis, and they're all ones that are reasonable to do in a distributed form. Also, just say a little about how does this really work. So imagine now that we have the distributed data set in all 17 organizations. The request, I showed you a cartoon that shows the data, the query goes out and the results come back. But this is really what happens. The query comes out and it wanders around for quite a while, and it ends up back here. So I won't take you through all the steps, but it's not small work. On the other hand, we are processing hundreds of queries a year now from FDA, and it's possible to do this on something that starts to approach reasonable production levels that can support a national system for post-marketing safety surveillance. Now, what about data sharing? So for the study that I just showed you, by the way, the study that I showed you has millions of people. That is not doses given. Millions of people were involved in, millions of people's data were part of that angioedema study that I just described. No person-level data was shared to do this study. On the other hand, there was, from the perspective of the investigators, complete information sharing. Essentially everything that was interesting in those data sets that could answer this question was accessible and used to address the questions of interest. So what does that mean? It means to us that it should be possible to address a very large fraction of the questions for which we usually have historically thought it was important to do data sharing by sharing programs among organizations that are prepared to collaborate on doing distributed analyses. And therefore, it would be possible to have them participate in a variety of kinds of networks. So here's a schematic showing the way the FDA Mini Sentinel operates. But you could imagine that some of those organizations might also participate in an NIH distributed network. And that network could be include health plans, it could include hospitals, and it could include research data sets of the kind that come out of the clinical trials that we're talking about here. Obviously, they have different kinds of data in them, so you can't ask the same question of every data set, and you can't submit the same program to every data set, but to the extent that they either have or can be converted into the same data format, you could use that approach. And you could have a bunch of other networks. You could make your network here. So the logic of this is every organization could choose to participate in multiple networks. Each network can control its own governance, because we talked a lot about governance. Who should have access and what should their responsibilities be? But on the other hand, the networks could amortize the not small costs of infrastructure development, data curation, libraries of analytics, and a whole array of things could be amortized over the whole operation. It's not completely a pie in the sky operation. Last week the NIH announced the creation of the Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory that Rob Califf is leading. As part of that, there is a plan to develop an NIH distributed research network that would have the capability of communicating with the entire Mini-Sentinel distributed data set, the trials that are funded under the collaboratory, and essentially any data set at any site. So I'll just leave you with the thought that our goal should be to share information and not data, and that if we approach things that way, we might be able to make more progress sooner than we would if we have to nail down all the issues around sharing the data itself. Thank you.
Questions? A couple I have, Richard, if you could talk a little bit about what you think you can't do with this model versus sharing the data.
Well, things we can't do now very well are certain kinds of regression analyses that require a lot of iteration of the data. You can actually do distributed logistic regression, but you can't do distributed, fully distributed survival analyses. So our goal is not never to share data. Our goal is to share as little data as possible. Turns out when you have to make an analysis data set, that's always a very small fraction of all the data that exists. What you'd like to do is have access to all the data that exists to make the compact analysis file, which usually can be de-identified. So for instance, if you had to have access to all the data, I submit it's almost impossible to de-identify that. I mean, how many people are there with my date of birth who live in my zip code who had a physical therapy session at the Brigham and Women's Hospital last January 4th? Not very many. So on the other hand, if all you need to know is, did somebody who was age 65 to 70 who lived in the 024 zip code, 3-digit zip code, have physical therapy in January, that's not a serious problem. So I provided a maximalist example where we analyzed the data from millions of people and didn't have to transfer everything. But there are gradations here, so you can say we absolutely have to have an analyzable data set. It needs these 15 variables. And those variables would typically be, what's the age bracket that we need, not the date of birth? How many days was it from the date of the index myocardial infarction until the ICD failed? A propensity score maybe to have all the comorbidity in it. So the analysis data sets that you would have to create would be ones that are ones that I think many people would have much less concern about sharing.
Since we ought to do this, can you say a little bit more about exactly how you would do a randomized clinical trial, let's say involving an HMO, an academic medical center, and a health plan? All at the
Okay,
same time?
do y'all hear that? So Rob's question. Oh, shoot! You heard it. I'm trying to take a little extra time to think of the answer. So, I think this is pretty straightforward, Rob. To the extent that there is a common case report form, first of all, I think it would be entirely reasonable for a clinical trial to say we need all the data from our clinical trial in a single place. I mean, I'm willing to go the extra mile and say how do we keep those data separate? But what I've been hearing about sharing data is sharing between one clinical trial and another clinical trial. But let's try to do the worked example of a site within a within one clinical trial. That's the challenge you just gave me, right? It seems to me if you wanted to do that, you could set up a data sharing system like this, and you'd say, on a daily basis, we will run a program that says how many patients were recruited, and it would do a series of quality checks on them, and then name the steps that you would take on a daily basis, and we would distribute them to the sites, and those programs would execute. And you get a result back, and you'd say this patient's in compliance or not in compliance. We got to do a follow-up. There's an exception. There's an adverse reaction. I'm not sure there's a serious barrier to doing that. Would you use that to do the randomization? I don't think so. I think when you enroll the patient, you'd call home and say, I have a new patient. What's the study number on that? So at least in principle, I think that would be something that would be possible to do. Whether it's worth it or not, I'm not so sure. But
Questions, Richard. So who is able to submit queries to Mini Sentinel right now, today, and who would be able to do it in the future, and how much of that is cancer data?
So right now, Mini Sentinel is wholly owned and operated by the FDA. So it's a public health activity of FDA's. So FDA can submit questions. I mean, we who are operating it for Mini Sentinel can't. FDA's view is that this should be a national resource and is working pretty hard to develop ways to make it more accessible. One of my hopes is that as the NIH Distributed Research Network gets traction, that NIH might find ways to make these data accessible. I'm looking at Josie Briggs, who's the NIH owner. Is that a so that to the extent that NIH develops rules of governance that allow people to submit data, on that last slide I showed that all of the Mini Sentinel data sites will be technically accessible. They would one by each. They would have to agree to participate in any particular study, but to the extent that the NIH can have a more open format, because it's not operating as a public health organization, but as a research organization, I think that might be a vehicle for opening it up. How much cancer data? These are the populations of 17 health plans. So it's United, Aetna, WellPoint, Humana, Kaiser, Group Health. So it's their patients who have cancer who are in it.
Richard, can you say something about the surveillance process? Do you anticipate that this will be a continuously automatic system or one driven by queries? For example, are you going to update the entire drug portfolio and look for signals, or are you going to wait till there's a generated idea and then dig into your data to understand the aspect?
Both. So the data set gets updated from each organization updates its data quarterly, so that it gets fresher each time. And there are basically two modes that FDA works in. Sometimes a question arises and they say, look back over the experience that you've had. I mean, that's what the angioedema example is. We are doing the heavy lifting now to develop the prospective system. So the goal, FDA's goal is for us to be able to take new products as they come onto market and then monitor them every time the data is refreshed, looking for evidence of up to 10 to 20 potential adverse outcomes that they're particularly interested in monitoring.
Take one more question.
Sharon Murphy from IOM. Richard, I wonder if you'd comment a bit more on the commonalities or heterogeneity of the electronic health record systems in these distributed networks. Are they all the same vendor, proprietary? Some must have institutional thing. How similar does each site have to align with their electronic records in order to be in a distributed network? Can there, or how do you adjust for that? Or
It's a ton of work to get them. You know the old wheeze, if you've seen one EHR, you've seen one EHR. Most of the data we have comes from claims, and claims are much more standardized than electronic health records. But even the claims require a staggering amount of work and local expertise. That's one of the points that was made this morning. You really need to have local experts who understand how the data came to be the way they are in order to understand what's in them. And so it's been a great deal of work to standardize the claims, even though they start off looking pretty standardized. And it's much more work to do the EHRs. The EHRs, and we shouldn't expect, I think we shouldn't expect that the EHR standardization will just occur unless we're talking about specific data elements that are needed for meaningful use. But otherwise, the appropriate direction that EHR development has taken has been to say there can be a lot of local customization. And as soon as you have local customization, it means that they're not standardized. So the fact that about 10% of our population has EHRs, I think all but one of them are using Epicare as the base. It's a great deal of work, even to get temperature, height, weight, blood pressure out of them. It's a lot of standardization work. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. We're going to move now to session 3, standardization and governance. And maybe the quote of the day will be even more apropos that we're talking about going backwards on high heels. I want to introduce to you our two chair people. Dr. Frank Rockhold is currently the Senior Vice President, Global Clinical Safety and Pharmacovigilance at GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceutical Research and Development. And Lynn Hudson, Dr. Hudson serves as the Chief Science Officer for the Critical Path Institute and the Executive Director of the Multiple Sclerosis Consortium. I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Lynn and I are going to divide and conquer here today, so we've split up the session. I'm here not only as my role of Head of Safety and Pharmacovigilance, but I also am responsible for our internal data disclosure transparency policy. So I'm here not only just as a scientist, but I have a great interest in the transparency area. And also, in my spare time, I was past chair of the CDISC organization, which you'll hear a speaker from today. So I have a real interest in promoting pragmatic use of standards. The balance of standards and governance is a delicate one. Too little or none prevents progress, prevents access to information. Too much stifles the process and creates a lag in access. So getting that balance right is important in any project like this. So the purpose of today's discussion is to outline some of the issues. And just as the discussion with data privacy, the idea here is to set up an atmosphere to enable the data sharing process, not to place hurdles in its path. So the first 4 of the speakers are going to talk about use of standards to facilitate data sharing. So we have speakers from FDA, from the Nonprofit Standards Organization, and an individual from Merck. And I'll introduce them in turn. So they're going to sort of set up the session, facilitate standards. Lynn, in a moment, is going to pose some questions that we've come up with for you to think about. Is what are some of the issues in the background here around standards that you ought to think about as you're listening to the speakers. We're going to have 2 discussion sessions, one after the first 4 speakers, and then we'll have a more formal panel discussion after all of the speakers are done, and Lynn will facilitate the second half of the session. So before I introduce the first speakers, I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Frank. It was exciting for me to hear the phrase liberating data at this morning's session, because I never took time in my youth to join a movement, but now I can feel part of a data liberation movement. So we asked each of our speakers to consider the following questions. When are data standards essential? What types of data analyses are enabled by standards? How do data standards affect data quality? To maximize data access and analysis of multiple clinical trials, should drug developers pool and standardize their clinical trial data, or should the FDA take the lead in providing a data mining resource for qualified investigators? Who owns and maintains the data? Who decides what an ethical and constructive use of the data looks like? Who pays to get the data in the standards format? The current data owners have paid for it once. Who pays to use it the second time? Is this data effort meant to be inclusive, invite anyone to donate data, or target certain areas and request it? And finally, how does the user know if the data being shared with them is representative of the universe of data on that topic?
So while you're pondering those questions, don't expect to get answers to all those today, but the first speaker is Ron Fitzmartin from FDA. Unfortunately, Marianne Slack had a family emergency, wasn't able to join us today, so Ron has agreed/volunteered, I'm not sure which, to step in for Marianne, and he's back in the back of the audience, so he's going to go through the talk that Marianne was going to give. So thank you very much to Ron for quickly coming up to speed on this topic. So.
Yes, good afternoon. Marianne sends her apologies. I know she really wanted to be here. Oh, hi. Yeah, Marianne asked me to fill in for her. And I've been close to some of this material for quite a bit. I was in industry for 25 years before joining the FDA. I've been with the FDA now for just less than a year. And I always wanted, while in industry, as my background is statistics, I always wanted the FDA to feel my pain and understand all the stuff that we have to go through to put together, to do clinical trials, put together the submission. And now being on the FDA side, I certainly see and feel the FDA statistical and medical reviewers' pain and what they have to go through. Now, we're going to see if we can work these. Probably went the wrong way. There we no. Yep. Okay. So the problem has been the problem for years. I mean, you could have seen that first bullet many years ago, and it's unbelievable that in 2012 we're still saying that there's extreme variability and unpredictability of the format and content of applications. But it's true. A statistic is back in 2011, only about 40% of applications used CDIS standards. That's hard to believe. Recently, I think about 2 weeks ago, I was at the SCDM meeting, and I asked the audience, how many of you guys are full speed with CDIS standards? It was about 50%. And the rest were thinking about it, or it was like deer in the headlights. Very interesting that that's where we are today. I think about, as a statistician in industry with one product, and over the years having to come up with the company standard. But think about the FDA reviewer who has to deal with all of the standards that are submitted to them, and they have to do this within the PDUFA timeframe guidelines for review. And what does that do? Well, it just impacts on being able to do in-depth analyses, because what you have are reviewers who are writing their own programs trying to make sense of the data. So it is still a major problem. This is just a slide of the workload, about a year's worth of INDs and meetings. So over and above what the statistical and medical reviewers are at their desk reviewing applications, they're also dealing with a lot of other stuff day in and day out. So tremendous workload, and workload that seems to be increasing. I think Marianne put this slide because this is the 21st century review, and everything's supposed to be really fast. But if you look at what's in that circle, the time frame for conducting a review, after you get through all of the processes of getting to the point of when you're ready, that medical reviewer, stat reviewer is ready to sit down and actually review the submission. That's not a lot of time where they have to come up with a decision. So what's this all about? This is all about standards and tools that will be able to expedite the review process. So PDUFA, everyone knows what FDASIA, a lot of people call it FDASIA, a lot of people call it FDASIA, but I won't go into folks at FDA are using both pronunciations, but FDASIA reauthorizes PDUFA, so PDUFA 5, and in 12.E, clinical terminology standards. This is a major section of Section 12. There's a ABCD talks about mandating electronic submissions, and this section E and G talk about terminology and therapeutic area standards. And so the goal is by 2017, to start publishing these clinical data terminology implementation guides. The nice thing about the PDUFA reauthorization letter, it doesn't say how many. I'm glad that was so. However, I'll show you another slide. So the other goal is to work on a project plan. That is already in the works. I started at FDA in February. There wasn't a day doesn't go by that we don't talk about PDUFA 5. Every single day in my group, we talk about PDUFA 5 and how we can get these commitments completed over the next 5 years. And there'll be guidances. We're also talking about how that will work. What process besides the normal, the regular clearance process for guidance can we use? We know that there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, so we're looking at an expedited way to clear a lot of these documents. So internally, the technical documents would have a pathway, and the FR notice announcing the guidance would have another pathway. So this is the 58 and 5. It used to be 55 and 5. It sounded really nice, 55 and 5, but people seem to be adding more. So I don't know whether it's 58. It's somewhere around that. This is just a pretty graphic. There's also another. There's the link there. There's another document on the website that provides this information in a spreadsheet. But I presented this here. Marianne and I like to present this slide because it's people ask a lot of questions about that slide. Number one, they can't read it, but it looks pretty. So that's the task at hand. Whether all of those will be done in 5 years, don't know. It's not going to be the FDA alone that does this. By any means, the FDA cannot do this. It's all about collaboration to get this done. So, there's a number of organizations, as some of you might know, that are converging on the need to get this done. And the first one is CFAST. How many know what CFAST is? Okay, a few. All right. You all know what CDISC is, right? CDISC, right? And CPATH, right? Of course. So CPATH and CDISC came together and have an agreement, a collaboration, and formed this entity called CFAST, Coalition for Accelerating Standards and Therapies, focused on the therapeutic area standards, could be focused on some other initiatives as well, but certainly one of the key ones is the therapeutic area standards. How about Transcelerate? It's been in the press over the past couple of weeks. Yes. Originally, the Heaver group of 10 or so pharma companies have were meeting over the past 15 years or so. Finally, they decided that they're going to actually maybe do something. I don't know. And they decided that they were going to come up with 10 initiatives and focus on then 5. And one of those 5 are clinical standards. So, again, in my 25 years in industry, it was rare to see a VP of clinical development care one way or another about standards. But this is big as far as I'm concerned, that standards have been recognized as important to streamline clinical trials and getting drugs, medical products on the market. And HL7, of course, FDA has been collaborating with HL7 and with the KIC for a number of years now, and a very important component in the bigger picture of healthcare. So what's FDA's participation in the CFAST initiative? Well, certainly we're going to provide scientific and technical direction. Scoping is, as you can imagine, the areas are critical because to get this done, one has to be focused and not boil the ocean, but certainly get the first cut. The FDA subject matters will be available for review of the documents and the standards when ready. And of course, FDA, as I mentioned before, will publish draft and final guidance. And because this is under PDUFA 5, they will be enforceable. So just a quick picture of what that governance looks like of CFAST. You see I'm not going to go through all of this, but you see up in the steering committee that FDA does have a seat. Marianne Slack and I sit on the steering committee for the therapeutic area standards program of CFAST. And again, it's not going to get done with just a steering committee. It's going to take many teams to get this done. The industry volunteers, of course, the reviewer community within the FDA, and the SDOs who have to work to finalize these standards. The last couple of slides I have, just going into some examples of where standards have made a difference. There's a pilot going on at FDA in Cedar using SAS's clinical data integration tool. That tool is working with a product called eDish. No, that's not a satellite. It's not another cable company, but it is pretty interesting name. It stands for Electronic Drug-Induced Serious Hepatotoxicity. And this tool needs those data that are sitting there on the right. However, they need them in a SDTM in a specified format for eDish. So what the CDI tool did is take in the SDTM data and map it to the eDish required format. And what was being done, or is currently being done, is the reviewers have to piece together all of these data to do this. And the pilot process using the CDI showed that they could map once and use many times. And one of the plots, this is the product is Xantra versus warfarin, and just shows that you could see the outliers there, the elevated values, and you could click on those and drill down in to the patient level. I don't have much time, so I'm going to go quickly through this one. This is another tool. This is a Medra-based tool developed by CETA reviewers to, it does a number of things. It generates analysis data sets. You see that with the use of the tool, a medical officer made a discovery of anaphylaxis that was unrecognized by a sponsor. And it generates a standard table. And then industry has been doing this for decades. Standard table listings and figures, TLFs, right? But think about FDA getting all of the different standards and trying to do an analysis. Well, if the FDA gets the SDTM data, gets the standard data, then they can run it through their standard routines for tables, listings, and figures, and produce and do a faster review. So they see what they need for their review. It's traceable, which is very important to the reviewers. So this is a key to using standards. So these are just 3 examples of using standards to expedite review. I think that's it. Oh, I got 9 seconds. No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you sit up here? I think we're going to withhold questions to all the speakers because I think they'll tie nicely together. Our next, Ron's talk reminds me of saying, somebody in my company said, "We love standard. That's why we have dozens of them." So, Becky Cush is going to be our next speaker. Becky is, Dr. Cush is the founder and president and CEO of CDISC, and I'm involved in many of the efforts that you've heard already today. I've had the pleasure of working with Becky on the board for the last 8 years, and so I'm sure you'll enjoy what she has to say.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I heard a rumor that standards almost didn't make the cut because a lot of people don't think that they're necessary. And then we ended up right after lunch, which everybody knows standards are so interesting that I hope that my job here is to let you see how someone can be passionate about this. And Frank knows that that's what I am. So when I saw this magazine, how many of you have seen this one, the Time magazine? Your data for sale, everything about you is being tracked. Get over it. So the author of this went out to find all the data that he could find about himself on any kind of place that he could find that information, and found that about half of it was correct. About the other half was obviously incorrect. And I think when you're talking about clinical research, it's really important to have that data quality. Maybe it doesn't matter if you're marketing shampoo or something, but when your medical needs are in the hands of people with that data, that's important. And I really like this quote. It's an excellent paper that Sharon Terry wrote about the patients being ready to share their data, and it's not the patient that's the problem. So we've heard enough about that today, but I think they are ready to share that data. However, as Frank Rockwell would say, unless we can use that data appropriately or find it, you have broken your informed consent agreement with that patient. So this is really important. And I did this slide while I had the privilege of living in Japan for 2 years. and this is what, to them is sushi grade data. But there's also the buffet style. So there are different purposes for quality. And I had a talk at one of the IOM workshops on quality. So I put this slide together, which is totally my speculation. But I think that there are different purposes and different needs for quality. And when you're looking at marketing or sales, maybe you don't have to have perfect data. But when you're looking at clinical decisions and clinical research, you want that data to be pristine. So at this point, we've got the sushi grade at the top. And I think that clinical research has really led the path in terms of trying to come up with quality data, because the processes have been developed over the last several decades. And this is from a workshop that was put together by DIA and FDA in the year 2000 with the Road to Clinical Quality Data. And what you see in this list that I won't go through with you right now is there's a lot of things that point to standards, including the one that says standardized, but clearly define the data and specify requirements. That's really what you're doing with the data, and how to limit the number of times the data are handled and those sorts of things. So this is what we're heading towards. Again, I don't want to go through all of this. I don't know how many of you know about CDISC. Not too many raised their hands when Ron asked about it. But we have been around since 1997, started as a completely volunteer group. We incorporated as a nonprofit in 2000, and we are known as a standards developing organization. And we work with a number of other standards developing organizations, ISO TC 215 for healthcare, Health Level 7. We run a joint initiative council around the globe to harmonize standards where we can. But we really focus on clinical research data. That's where CDISC focuses. And this is our vision of informing patient care and safety through higher quality medical or clinical research. And this is our suite of standards. Some of these have 2-day courses that go along with them and how to understand them, but they go from protocol and study design all the way through to analysis and reporting. And the idea is to have all these standards working together and go from end to end in the clinical research process and make sure that they're serving their purpose. And we have the ones that Ron was talking about, which is once you collect all the data on the case report form and put it into the database, then you come up with some tabulations, and that's study data tabulation model. And you have the analysis data sets with the analyzed data with the statistical analyses. And that's where CDISC really does things that are very different than what you would do in a healthcare setting. This is the research piece. And this is the standard for case report forms, CDASH, which was done under the Critical Path Initiative that Janet Woodcock's known for. And just to make sure that these standards don't break each other and that you can take the data from end to end, we have them harmonized through what we call the bridge model. And we also have controlled terminology that goes end to end to make sure that they work together. And then we have a standard that allows you to transport this information in XML. So again, I don't have 2 days to give a course on those, but what we're really talking about is this is a very interesting piece of information that came out of the Office of Women's Health at FDA when they tried to figure out if they had males or females and how many of them on the studies. And you have M and F in one set of and called sex. Here we have gender and it's male and female. Here we have sex again, but it's zeros and ones. Here we have gender and you've got 1 and 2. So how do you go through this data except by hand to really figure out what you've got in terms of males or females in the studies? The HITSP set has 4 options. HL7 has somewhere around 15. Chuck can tell you exactly. But this is a serious issue in terms of just finding out what sex or is it gender that you have in a study. And so what we've done is try to make it so that we have standards that go all the way from the protocol through the case report form, through data capture in the database, through SDTM and ADAM. And The XML standard that I talked about earlier was specifically designed to carry case report form data, and it's very important and very broadly used within vendors who do electronic data capture tools and other tools throughout the clinical research industry because it supports 21 CFR 11, which is the regulations for tracking the audit trail and when the data were collected, were they changed? If so, why were they changed and who changed them? And this is a very important piece of what the auditors from FDA will audit when they go to a site after they see a submission. So I have 2 slides just to talk about a study that Gartner did with pharma. And this is the business case for CDISC standards. And the summary is that when the standards can save significant time and money and resources, but especially when they're implemented upfront at the beginning. So that goes back to our slide about the road to quality clinical data and building the quality in upfront. The standards did increase data quality. They help integrate data and enhance reusability. If you map at the back end, you lose about half of the information, and it facilitates exchange with partners. And interestingly enough, it improved team communications because they could always talk about this and talk in the same language. And it allows you to choose and pick software tools, because if those tools support the standards, then you can exchange tools and you still haven't lost the data that you're trying to share with others. So this is just a slide showing the value that you mostly get the value if you implement them upfront in the process. Bridge, I mentioned Bridge earlier. I want to talk just a little bit, and Chuck will follow me, but talk about how CDISC and HL7 complement each other. And we've worked with HL7 for the last decade. One of the models that's a collaborative model that is core stakeholders, CDISC, National Cancer Institute, FDA, and HL7 have a collaborative model that's open, and it's global, and it's put together to represent protocol-driven research. And we called it Bridge. I can tell you what that means. It's down here on the bottom of the slide. But the main idea was that it bridges all the standards together, it bridges different organizations, and it bridges healthcare and research. And it actually has a layer that's mapped to the HL7 RIM. So one of the other pieces of information I wanted to share today, we were just talking about meaningful use and the use of electronic health records. We had the last use case that made it through the HITSP process when the HIT standards panel was convened, and now this hasn't gotten into meaningful use with the HIT Standards Committee quite yet, because they're still trying to get people to use electronic health records and exchange some preliminary information. But in meaningful use 3 and 4, this will become very important. And the use case was, how can we allow the EHRs to be different EHRs at different sites and yet share a core high-quality set of clinical research data. So this is, this is called an interoperability specification. It makes use of 3 standards. One is the continuity of care document, which is based on some work of HL7, and also that comes out of the EHR because that's the way to exchange information between EHRs, but we use an integration profile that's developed through integrating the healthcare enterprise, and it's very powerful. It actually takes an electronic form that's managed remotely into the EHR setting, collects the data that it can out of the EHR, you enter the remaining data, and it goes off back to whoever needed that form. So it's a way to collect a key set of information, and in this case, we're talking about CDASH, which is a core set of clinical research information that is required across all clinical trials, and it's known around the world. So you can produce a standard core research data set. It also enables 21 CFR 11 compliance, and it allows you to have multiple different EHRs in different sites and still produce CDASH, which is the standard case report form information, and then you can enter again the data that you still need for the trial. And this RFD is being implemented in Europe, in Japan, We have had it done in some post-marketing studies in the U.S., and there's a challenge out now to have it done on an actual regulated study. It has also been used on a study to do adverse event reporting, which Pfizer supported at Harvard. And you can see the power of this as a workflow tool, not just standard, but a standards-based workflow implementation, in that doctors at Harvard who had never really been reporting adverse events because it took 35 minutes out of their day, time to see a patient or two, and by implementing this, they were able to report adverse events in less than a minute, and it started happening. So this is a real workflow improvement effort. And CDISC does not work alone. I didn't do all this work. We have thousands of volunteers around the world. And I just wanted to point out a few of our key partners. The National Cancer Institute houses all of our controlled terminology in their enterprise vocabulary services. You just heard about CPATH and our partnership, and you will hear more about it in a few minutes. Duke we work with, and they started actually some of the therapeutic area standards that we've been doing through an NIH roadmap grant. And TRI, which is the Translational Research Informatics Institute in Japan, when they provide funding for the studies at academic settings, they tell them to use CDISC standards. And IMI, I was just at IMI Tuesday. They are teaching the consortium members for about 23 projects about CDISC and saying, use CDISC if it's available. If not, help them develop the standards that need to augment what we're doing. And Transcelerate, I won't go into that. You just heard from Ron about Transcelerate. I will leave you with a tool that we still need to produce, which we call SHARE, which is Shared Health and Research Electronic Library. So what we're finding is that we really need to put a lot of these standards, which are on paper and in spreadsheets, into a way that they're readily accessible electronically. They will help us develop the therapeutic area standards that Ron Fitzmartin just talked about easier, and to share them and make them more broadly available. And so that's a tool that we are looking at how to develop and how to collaborate on it, because CDISC wants to collaborate and make all these open and freely available standards like the standards we already have. And this is my last slide, is to talk about what I see as the desired criteria for standards to facilitate clinical research, which is that they are fit for their purpose, and that is going to come out more in meaningful use. Not all of the EHR standards are going to work for research purposes, so we need to make sure we have what we need. They need to be global, because clinical research is a global exercise and is happening all around the world. We have at least 90 countries downloading our standards right now. We need to make sure they're based on GCPs and applicable regulations, and that they're harmonized from end to end, that they're developed through an appropriate SDO process, and that they're not proprietary. We've been joking about all the standards out there, but there's really, it's not that you need proprietary or redundant standards. You need people to agree, and there is no right or wrong in standards. It's how are we going to agree to go forward and use these. And they need to be platform independent and encourage innovation, not make it so it's difficult to do what we want to do. We have to make sure that people can design trials the way they need to design them and still use standards to exchange the information and then to support a link with healthcare. So I hope I left you with something that lets you see that CDISC isn't just standards, but also a number of other activities that we are trying to promote to help facilitate research.
Thank you, Becky. Next, we have Dr. Chuck Jaffe. Chuck is the CEO of HL7, Health Level 7. Chuck's had many years of fabulous accomplishments in healthcare information technology and has been a great partner to CDISC.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to share thoughts with you. I met Becky here in Washington almost 13 years ago. We were on a panel together to talk about the integration of healthcare and clinical research data. A lot that's evolved in the past decade has come because of the cooperation between our organizations and between the leadership that's been involved. I have developed such thick skin over the past decade, hearing jokes about how many standards there are. Actually, we have 14 genders. Why would I exaggerate? I'm a social liberal, and so you are whatever you tell me you are, and that's okay, except if you have a Y chromosome, you need it to be treated. You need your care dependent upon having that chromosome. We have the other ones because of issues with behavioral medicine, correctional health care, military medicine, and so forth, who apparently need the other designations. I would have been happy with M and F myself. For many of you, HL7 is just the exchange of healthcare data, but it really is derived from a much more complex process. HL7 is thousands of volunteers around the world. The organization was founded 27 years ago in a classroom at Penn, the objective of which was to get administrative data into an electronic format. It quickly evolved into having clinical data. And the next step, which led to the creation of version 2, was its ultimate downfall. It was about making HL7's specifications backwardly compatible, which certainly puts a constraint on all the legacy systems and the innovative new processes, but also because it permits customization and realm localization. And it is those features which create incompatibility between the systems. As the versioning of HL7 progresses, the optionality doesn't change, but the interoperability improves because the optionality is managed. The features that permit exchange of data at a clinical level or between the clinical community and research demands are more functional and are able to overcome the hurdles of the uniqueness of implementations. One of the keys that we have emphasized over the years is our collaboration, and in fact, HL7 collaborates with a tremendous number of organizations, IEEE at a technical level, caregiver organizations, and certainly with patient advocacy groups. HL7 has amongst its members hundreds of academic health centers around the world and public health agencies in the United States and in 45 countries. HL7 partners with the regulated research community as well as with the academic environment, and I know you're out there even with government. HL7 is a complex organization, and while we don't deliver care, the quality initiatives that have been emphasized within meaningful use and in other realms have reduced errors, improved the quality delivery paradigm, and have been able to impact the cost spiral even through the 2011 analyses. On airplanes and trains and buses, I get accosted for writing that damn electronic healthware. The fact is that the systems that are written are built upon the HL7 standards, and while we don't build the EHR, we certainly develop the EHR functional model, the personal health record functional model, and other domain models for cardiology, pediatrics, and clinical research. The bridge process is one of the exciting commitments that HL7 has made to the research world. In fact, it's predicated upon the need. Am I an echo here? Oh, sorry. It's predicated upon the need of passing information seamlessly between patient care and clinical research. I've been struck by the lack of research that is enabling patient care, particularly the time lag between the basic research and the implementation in care processes. Today, right now, at our most elite institutions, we're asking patients who've had orders for radio contrast X-ray studies, whether they are allergic to iodine, shrimp, shellfish, and the like. The reaction, though sometimes fatal, is not an allergy, and it's not related to shrimp, shellfish, or iodine, and that was known in 1971. We spend $500 million a year on alternatives to make that happen, and I was an intern the year that report came out. HL7 also contributes to the claims attachments and other features for accelerating the adjudication of claims and the claims process. Not only is there collaboration with CMS, but with the payment systems in countries around the world. This is supported not only by the technology, but by the binding of vocabulary and other terminologies that are so critical in reimbursement processes. HL7 really has a family of products. It's more than just the messaging. In fact, this slide has the most words on it of any slide, I promise you. This is just a sampling of some of the products and services that HL7 has within its portfolio. We're proud of the contributions that we make to areas as diverse as data capture and distribution for mobile health, and analysis and implementation of genomic data. My second quibble with people on the bus is they can do it in their ATM, but why can't they do it with their health records? At last count, there were 3.2 billion bits of data in the human genome. I don't think my banking record has that many variables. English has about 300,000 words in its vocabulary. Becky has command of about half of them. There are 1.3 million unique terms in the National Library of Medicine, and the ability to share information is predicated on understanding the meaning of those. It raises the level of complexity for exchanging healthcare data, and for this reason, we've collaborated with the standards developers for SNOMED, CPT, LOINC, and ISO in the enablement of less complex data exchange. HL7 is about change. The fundamental adoption of HL7 2.3, which certainly is the legacy that most electronic health records are dedicated to, is really a function of ideas from a decade and a half ago. So as HL7 progresses and the technology increases, so do the specifications upon which it relies. Foremost of these was now over a decade ago with the creation of the information model upon which version 3 depends. It carries with it a great deal of baggage, complexity, overhead, difficulty in enablement, and other features that confound authors of specifications that rely on version 3, as well as the people who have to implement them. We do have a number of technologies, however, that are based on version 3 and the information model, which are really changing around the world. One of these is our clinical document architecture. Not only is it the centerpiece for meaningful use as it's now written, but it's implemented around the world for various functionality. In its simplest form, it's just an envelope into which you can drop a waveform or an artifact or a image or even, heaven forbid, a clinical document. And on the other end, out comes the same information without ambiguity or process change. In the envelope, you can put a template that includes almost any of the concepts or ideas in healthcare or clinical research. The continuity of care document, which really uses the continuity of care record to constrain it, became the foremost exchange process for meaningful use 1. The so-called consolidated CDA, which really was a harmonization project between 3 SDOs, has refined that process. We still don't have what most clinicians would require for an electronic health record, which is a chief complaint. So that's easily added to the family of templates within any CDA exchange. And lastly, you can add information to this document for uses such as decision support, electronic reporting, personal health records, and the like. CDA has been adopted because you don't have to understand the complexities of the information model and yet still overcome the challenges of interoperability. This is a listing of some of the many diverse applications of CDA around the world. We anticipate that Meaningful Use 3 will heavily rely on this, and much of our development efforts surround this. Trifolia is a new opportunity. It's a repository of CDA templates. It's freely available, and these templates can be modified, added to, reused for many different applications without writing any of the implementation guides. The last of these slides talks about some of the newer and braver efforts around enhancing interoperability and reducing the complexity of the process. One of these, which arose from the HL7 Fresh Look initiative, is called SIMI. It's about information, clinical information modeling, and has been embraced by organizations worldwide. FHIR, which was demonstrated earlier this month in Baltimore, enabled 9 organizations around the world to create a message within minutes rather than 3 to 4 months, as is typical in a development process. This uses the information model but hides all the complexity behind a curtain. So I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. Certainly we have been focusing on knowledge, and we at HL7 try not to get lost in the data. But I think more than anything, HL7 is about collaboration. Without the partnerships of CDISC, the vocabulary organizations, and other standards developers, we couldn't make this happen. So I leave you with this last thought. Thank you.
I don't know if it's part of the genetic selection to be involved in standards, but each of the first three speakers spoke for exactly 15 minutes, so pressure's on. Chuck's example of the envelope reminded me of a story. I, for years, tried to convince our president of R&D that standards were important, and I think he was resisting because he thought I was trying to stifle the creativity of his researchers. And finally, one day, he's a bright man, he called me up and says, I get it. He says, standards are like the post office. Doesn't matter what you put in the envelope, but if you don't put the address in the right place, the stamp on the right place, and return address, they won't mail it. I said, you guys, that's all I need to know. Go ahead. Our next speaker is Sachin Jain, who's the Chief Medical and Information Officer at Merck, also has a position at Harvard Medical School. He's going to give us another example about facilitating healthcare informatics and standards.
So Merck actually sent me here today to share the results of a clinical trial that the peak time for an audience to start to go to sleep after a meal is 1 hour and 12 minutes, and that's why I'm speaking to you at this particular moment. I've actually learned a lot today, and I want to thank the IOM for hosting this meeting. I think this is a very important exchange between industry and academia. I'm going to try to tell you about the emerging health information strategy that we have at Merck. I think the industry more broad, healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry more broadly, is operating in a vastly different context than it has historically. In Merck's old world, most innovation and development came from a small set of usual suspects. There was this very simplistic notion that if you develop it, you could prescribe it and it would get sold and used. There was payment for volume and unconstrained growth. We had paper medical records. Measurement was really restricted to clinical trials. The physician was really the focus of our activity. The physician was a trusted intermediary. And data really was in the hands of a few. And data in that world was power. In Merck's new world, I think there's an increasing recognition, in our new world rather, I think there's an increasing recognition that there's going to be a lot more participants in the world of innovation, that there's a need to demonstrate the comparative effectiveness of our products, that payment for healthcare services will be driven by the value that they actually create for patients, not just the volume of services delivered. Health information technology is going to be a mainstay of the infrastructure that we actually have underlying our healthcare system. And that new infrastructure is going to create both new responsibilities and new opportunities for all of the stakeholders across the healthcare system. There's going to be an increasing focus on continuous measurement of practice, and the patient will really be at the center of the core of everything that we do. And sort of underlying all of these currents is a movement towards data liberation. And we've heard tremendous examples of that today, and I think they provide us with a lot of hope for where we as a healthcare ecosystem will collectively progress to. And so, we've started what I think of as a living document. And it's a living document in part because this is a new world. There's going to be new rules that are going to be necessitated by new things that we discover about how all of the healthcare ecosystem players will interface with data. But I wanted to articulate what I think of as our company's values on the use of patient health information. The first of these values is that privacy and security needs to be, I think, at the core of everything that we do. Any of our efforts to use data will fail if we don't adequately support and protect the privacy and security of health information. The second piece is that Merck wants to work with patients and clinicians to transparently demonstrate the value, safety, and effectiveness of its products through careful longitudinal analysis of patient information. And that's only going to happen when we work together as a healthcare ecosystem, sharing data. And the third piece is that Merck will use patient health information to preserve access and promote use of effective medications that improve care of patients. And this is this notion of making sure that we use the highest levels of science and the highest standards to actually ensure that the studies that are done don't necessarily derail products that actually provide real benefit for patients. And that's, I think, a core interest of ours as a collective healthcare ecosystem. So, Merck has already, I think, assumed leadership in clinical trial transparency and in this data liberation movement. The first piece of this was really our move last year to make transparent our statistical analysis plans, our protocols for our clinical trials. And we actually proactively communicated this policy to 350 journal editors when it was announced last year, and the response was terrific. There was a sense that Merck was establishing real leadership in this space because this is an idea that simply whose time has come, and I think we've heard that message repeated over and over again this morning. And so. We have a particular framing that's, I think, very consistent with everything we've heard today around this issue of sharing participant-level data from clinical trials. The first piece is that there's this increasing recognition that there's significant amounts of data, both from within industry as well as academia, that is not being published that could be used to benefit patients. And we as a collective healthcare ecosystem need to do what we can to actually promote liberation of this data, both from within industry as well as outside of it. I think Harlan Krumholtz said it exactly right when he said that this is a problem of both academics as well as industry participants. And, where I would disagree with him is that I think the leadership needs to come from both places. Reflecting on the conversation that's happened today, it strikes me that the problem that we have today is not a technical one. It's not about standards. It's really a political and social one. And it's a political and social one that actually starts from our very first days as scientists and as clinicians, where we do have a culture of maintaining confidentiality, maintaining privacy, maintaining security, but we also have a culture of not sharing. Where we should be sharing, and as was mentioned by some of the patient advocates in the room, not asking permission. I think all of us recognize the value of this data when it is shared, but none of us individually has actively done our part to actually promote the ecosystem that we need to promote. So. For us, we're interested in partnering across the whole the whole of the ecosystem, in part because there are actually Merck scientists who want access to the data. As surprising as it may seem, there's Merck scientists who want access to the data that's being that's being developed by academic organizations and by academics. And so there is this, I think, broader recognition of the need for partnership and collaboration around transparency of data. I think there's an increasing recognition that there are selective publications of the real story of medications, and I think we want to participate in actually making sure that a full story is told about our medications. That's what's in the best interest of patients. That's what's in the best interest of the healthcare ecosystem. And finally, I think there's significant risk aversion on all sides around what might happen. And I think there's this fear, and it's I think a cultural problem and a social problem of being exposed. And it's not, or being exposed as incompetent or exposed for not actually having all of our ducks in a row. And I think it exists across all of the ecosystem players. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that and I think build structures in our collective strategy to actually solve that problem. And I was very encouraged by a lot of the conversation that happened earlier today around the ethics of sharing information as well as the academic culture and publication, because I think without those fundamental pieces in place, we're not going to be able to move forward together. So Merck is actually, in the early stages of making available patient-level clinical trial data. And so what we've done is actually built a formal door through which external investigators can actually approach the company and ask for access for data. And the data requests then go on to the product teams, which then have the opportunity to review the requests and very much as was sort of described in the case of the Medtronic presentation earlier today, actually begin to ask very thoughtful questions about the data request and interface with external investigators to agree upon a data sharing plan. And so this program was initially piloted in 2007, but has actually proceeded forth. Now we're in our 5th year of it, and there's increasing recognition of it both within the company. I think, as in all large organizations, I think, there are multiple doors, and so we've done some work to try to make this initiative known internally, but we can obviously do better. And we're also doing some work to make it be known externally. And we're seeing the results of that in that 43 requests for data were received. So far in 2012, 21 were fulfilled, and the gap that you're seeing actually reflects the number of applications that are actually still being discussed. There were 7 that were either withdrawn or rejected for a variety of reasons, but there are a number of other ones that are still pending, and we hope by the end of the year to be able to say that all of those were fulfilled. And so just some early lessons learned. I think, again, the message I want to leave you all with is that this is a social and political problem as much as a technical one. And so there are cultural sensitivities that we need to overcome within the walls of industry, but also within academia. I think it actually starts in academia, and the only way that we're going to be able to do this is to do it together. I think we as a company need to be more inside out as well as outside in. And what I mean by that is we need to open our doors more widely. We need to publicize the fact that we're willing to do this and willing to partner with external investigators around this, I think, in a more pronounced way. I think we need to streamline and unify our processes. The untold story is that, pharmaceutical companies, academic organizations are very complex. There's data transfer agreements that need to be put in place. We probably need to have dedicated staff to actually manage all of these external requests, and that's something that goes untold in some of this, in some of the conversation around these things. That this is probably a new area of business for us, as much as anything else, because it does take dedicated resources to actually execute on data transparency. I was struck by the presentation that cited the fact that it cost $2.5 million to do this study with Yale. I think that highlights the resource intensiveness of data liberation. It's very sort of easy to talk about, but I think the work of executing it will require dedicated resources, dedicated people, and as a company, we're I think willing to do that. But I think it's important for us to all recognize that these things just don't happen by themselves. And then finally, I want to leave you with this point that this is going to take multi-stakeholder collaboration, and Merck is willing to take a leadership role in actually making this happen. And I look forward to a productive discussion with all of you later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Sachin. We now have 20 minutes for discussion. We can either take questions from the audience or from the web. While you're assembling your thoughts, I'll pick up on a point that Sachin made at the end about reminding us how expensive it can be to go back and retrofit data to share it. And the first few speakers spoke to the issues of standards. So just a question to the panel. I mean, it's clear to anybody who's ever tried to do this that in retrospect they wish things had been standardized, but it's always wishing somebody had done it 5 years ago. So how do you, I mean, it's not an exotic topic, so how do you convince people, is it in monetary terms or some other way to convince people that they really need to think about striking the right balance of standards versus what they view as standards being a stifle to innovation? Welcome any and all to speak up.
I think all you have to do is look at asynchronous emails and realize that even with standardized English, it takes 4 or 5 emails back and forth to figure out what time you're going to meet. The standards process anticipates the ambiguity of human communication. We often trip over ourselves because we add complexity to the process, but we also improve the output of that communication. And I think that in itself is the best argument for the process.
Becky?
I talked to Paul Harris, who helped start an EDC tool called RedCap, and people love it because they can do whatever they want with it. And I think that investigators don't want to have their creativity inhibited. And he said, but when they get done entering the data, then they want to find it again and get it back out. They don't realize they're asking for standards. And you can actually put the standards in behind the scenes. They don't have to know that's how you're collecting male and female. And I don't think people realize that. So some more stories like your envelope letter would probably work well.
Thanks. Take some questions from the room.
Hi, I was thinking of Dr. Iannides' comment that, or his caution that if only some participant level data are released, there'll be a different form of selection bias. And I'm wondering, A, if what other people think of that, and also if we agree it's a concern, if when companies start to make initial steps into releasing data, if they would consider doing it, I guess the way Medtronic did with the Infuse data, say that you'll make all the data from a certain product available, so at least we have a sense that it's not just select studies.
I think that applies to everybody, not just companies.
It's just that companies are the ones that usually have multiple trials on the same topic. But.
Comments? Sachin, you want to?
Yeah, I think that this is a new field. I think the Medtronic announcement was, I think, really a first of its kind sort of leadership effort. And so, there's a lot to learn from that. And I think we're going to take a very close look at the work that they did at Yale in collaboration with Medtronic, and I think try to glean some of the best practices from that and join them, frankly.
Yeah, I can say, Deborah, we've been working on trying to do something similar to Merck for about the last 4 or 5 years, and Harlan mentioned it this morning. The word all is a difficult concept, so if you tell me, so I want all of the data on a project that's been studied for the last 15 years, the complexity, as you go back in time, the complexity becomes more and more difficult. If you told me I was going to release all from January 1st, 2013 on, I'd say that's a relatively simple exercise. So it does, the context is important, but it is absolutely the same question. I agree completely, which is one of the reasons why Lynn posed that question at the beginning. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Vickers. I'm actually speaking tomorrow, so I might steal my own thunder here, but I just feel I have to say this because it's come up over and over and over again. How difficult, time-consuming, expensive, what a total headache it is to share data. I've published numerous data sets on the web. Many of them took fewer than 5 minutes to convert from the data set I analyzed as a statistician. I'm writing up the paper. I thought, oh, hang on, I better share the data set. The latest one we did was 9,000 patients in 4 institutions, huge observational data set. It took 8 hours to do the whole thing, mainly because we had to rewrite all the programming code, which we also put on the web, in order for people to it's complicated, but all that code had to be rewritten. So for the actual data, I can't imagine it would have taken more than an hour to do that. Now, the reason is, if we'd shared all of the data that was available on those 9,000 patients, that would have been a multi-year project. Mm-hmm. We shared all the data that was needed to on all the on what we published, and we published like 6 or 7 papers on the patients, what type of tumors they had, and when they recurred, and who their surgeons were, and whether the surgeon made a difference, and so on and so forth. And we've got to make a distinction. I think you can do 90% of the work in data sharing with pretty trivial investment of resources. The last 10%. To get all the data that you need, and sometimes that's important. I mean, if you're looking at a drug and you've got to go and look at all the adverse events, and and that can often be very important, and that is going to take a long time and perhaps millions of dollars. But I do not, I really have to stand. What's the right way of saying this? I really don't want people to leave this room with the impression that, in general, sharing data, or especially sharing clinical trial data, is incredibly expensive, because you can do an enormous amount of sharing, an enormous amount of work for absolutely trivial cost.
So you're saying, if I understand, selectivity and focus, if you use the 80-20 rule, basically, we can make our lives
more than
work.
that. It's like 90% can be done for 1% of the work.
Any comments from the panel? We look forward to your solution.
My only question back is just in light of Dr. Krumholtz's comments about sort of suspicion about industry. What's to say that the 90% that you're saying that one should publish is the right 90%, and the sort of questions that emerge around what's contained in the remaining 10%, I think would I think, raise confusion or questions for anyone consuming that data. That's just a question.
Like I said, the 90% is not always going to be enough, but very, very often it will be. I don't want the fact that the last 10% is so time-consuming and difficult to make things like that. It's going to be such a hassle to share the first 90%.
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to go back to Dr. Fitzmartin's talk and his comment that it's taken a while for people to even understand and embrace CDISC standards, and your surprise at the slow rate of uptake. If I follow you correctly, by a certain time, at least for industry-sponsored trials in certain areas, there will be enforceable common data standards, which I don't believe I'm hearing any resistance from industry. So I'm assuming that, but it's interesting in my new life outside of going back to the NIH, as I sit and hear council discuss the theme of standardization, immediately people say, oh, well, you're going to impose all this rigidity on us, you're going to stifle innovation. You've all mentioned that, and you sort of dismiss it as an issue, but it's not. In the academic community, the uptake, the ability to get people on board to really agree on common data elements in clinical trials funded by the NIH is still a huge hurdle. So I'm just wondering what the group thinks are proper incentives or processes to facilitate that, because our longitudinal ability to assess what we are really learning from years of studies invested, my area happens to be things like, the depression, schizophrenia, and all that, and Alzheimer's even, to learn from that cumulatively is incredibly frustrating. And we are all saying it's a simple thing technically to address. Yet that simple requirement of just saying that there be agreed upon in the community, as someone indicated, they're not right or wrong, but to get that alignment still seems to be a huge hurdle. So I'm just wondering what people think it would take to get more alignment, that when review committees look at things, you have an element on there that says, are data standards being part of the study? That's not reviewed, that's not looked at, I can tell you, okay? So I just like to throw that out for discussion. Chuck?
What you're saying is we need a benevolent queen. I couldn't agree more. She would just tell us what to do. When I was at NIH, I was a public health service officer, and yes, Lieutenant, you will do that. That's a simple solution. If you have 3 physicians in a room trying to decide on a data set, you have 4 very strong opinions. I think that consensus building, while the mantra of standards development doesn't always work if you want to be fast. It's more effective if you want to be agile, however.
Let me try and take that. I'm not the queen, but I might be the king. So I don't think it's as difficult. I mean, because I think at NIH we have the same issues. We fund a lot of research, and you can't compare things to each other because the data was collected differently. So now I think it's a maturation process that the investigators have to kind of hit the wall and realize, gee, I'm not getting anywhere unless I start combining data, and that may be a process that takes time for certain fields. But I can tell you at our institute, at some of the Neurologic Institute, and we've invested considerable time and money in doing exactly what Charles said, is getting groups together, locking the door, and saying you don't come out until you all decide. And it's all very doable. So we have common data elements now for about 11 different neurological diseases. Our problem now is we can't get traction with the people at the front table to try and move them forward. And I think there's a lot of interaction that could occur between the academics once you get to a community that realizes they really do need to come up with consensus common data elements. I think it's all very doable. And then how do you move that into CDISC or HLA7? I think that's the question I have. So we've been working with CDISC on Parkinson's for a couple of years, but we have 11 others. We just haven't been able to get any movement.
At NIAID, they developed data sets for HIV. the data sets were incompatible with TB and malaria, the two most common comorbid diseases. I think that goes a long way in describing even the intramural issues about agreement amongst the investigators. I think at some point a higher level initiative has to say enough is enough.
Becky?
I will say that when we talk about CDASH, that is completely harmonized with the case report form standards that are analogous to that at the National Cancer Institute. But now, like what you said, a lot of the NIH centers are doing their own therapeutic area ones, and I have to say that Lynn's actually started a standards effort at NIH going to happen on the 19th of November to bring some of that together and see what we can do about it.
It's a great discussion. Next.
I'd like to broaden the discussion of patient privacy in at least two ways. One is, even if the medical research enterprise is doing its best to meet privacy standards, the question that the Time magazine article that was cited raises for me is, will it be able to withstand the onslaught of big data and business analytics? A celebrated recent case is that Target often knows about pregnant daughters before their parents do. Another example would be with our smartphones and our geographic location being easily tracked. To deduce somebody is at a physical therapy center for physical therapy or at a dialysis center for dialysis doesn't require a whole lot of analytical brain power. So there are commercial interests that are using lots of different data sets in ways that, in my mind, can completely undo all the good effort that went with HIPAA, and there are more non-covered entities than covered entities. Those restrictions are in a pretty narrow space. So the question is, can we withstand, can our best efforts on privacy withstand what's happening in the general commercial space? And the next is a kind of sympathetic observation that as people's prognosis gets bleaker, their valuation of privacy declines pretty predictably against other objectives like some kind of therapy. And we don't seem to have given much attention to how to move with them, as opposed to try to set a universal standard that would be applicable to all. So any comments on either of those would be interesting.
I just want to echo your second comment. I'll put on my clinician hat for a second, and you just show me a sick person who's like really worried about their privacy or security. They mostly care about getting the right care at the right place at the right time, and they want their information to flow to the point of care. And so I think our weighting of patients in the sort of discourse around privacy and security often overweighs certain voices as compared to the sort of silent majority of folks who are actually really, I think, desperate to need care. So I just want to echo that sentiment. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that came up in a Learning Health Systems symposium that took place earlier this year that a number of participated in. The gentleman who was in charge of HIT for NHS said exactly the same thing. He said that the concern about privacy among patients is not necessarily well represented in the discussion. It's mostly a discussion among the lawyers. So, Mike.
Yeah, I too was impressed by the expense that Rick Kuntz mentioned, $2.5 million to take one data set and de-identify it and put it in a form that others could interrogate without breaking privacy. And most of us, I think, have been speaking from the point of view of ongoing institutions. And having recently left academia and thinking about some of the clinical trials I participated in, I'm trying to imagine now if somebody came to me and asked for data from 3 years ago when I left, and I had to come up, if it wasn't 2.5 million, but still a fair amount of money on an NIH grant that closed with no money left. I'm just, is there an allowance for that? Does anybody currently have a mechanism? So, because we've been talking about academia and industry participating equally in this, and I think the spirit around the room is that that's what people want. But there's a big financial implication if you're a single investigator working off a grant I just don't know how you can make this work?
No, that's one of the questions that the group came up with that Lynn posed in the beginning is there's a practical aspect about the financial implications of a lot of money went into doing the initial research. Now the data is there. Somebody wants to use it again. How does that get funded? How's the resource? Even if you're able to do it with smaller efforts with 90% of the data, as was suggested, it's still not zero. So,
okay.
So I don't know if any of I mean, it's clear. This group would tell you if you had collected the information in a standard way, it would be less expensive, but it's still not going to be zero.
Right.
Okay.
Steve Weitzman, MedData Foundation. Hello? Can anyone hear me? I was a fellow of the Food and Drug Law Institute back in 1968-69, and 10 major companies paid for my fellowship. And we're learning about sharing again. I've had 43 years, well, they'll find out if it was a mistake or not soon, 43 years in the industry. And I've watched the evolution that you put on that chart of the old model and the new model. This is amazing to me that the industry has finally come to the point that we've got to collaborate, we've got to cooperate with each other, we've got to share common stuff, but we've been doing it in the pharmaceutical industry for years. Rebecca, and how many hours went into HL7 and C-Disk? Charles, does anyone appreciate that? Richard Platt. Richard works so many hours a day that his hourly pay is really about $10 an hour. He's on every committee and everything, and so many of you are there. There's no appreciation on the Hill of what's being contributed and what's going to be contributed. Sure, there have been some things now that have been publicized with 4 drug companies coming together and giving a database, and now 10 drug companies coming together. And in medical records, which we're also in parallel concerned with, we've got the CCC group, Mayo, Intermountain, they're here, Cleveland Clinic, Kaiser. I mean, we're getting ready to share. And I'm just so happy that the zeitgeist has changed. But going to one of Michael's points, how are we going to pay for this? We are living in an era, once again, of limited resources. I go to speeches of Dr. Collins, and he's scared because 80% of his budget's committed, and if they rip it out on a percentage basis, he can't do any new projects. And he's got to take people off. So in addition to this, I think this is a selling point on the Hill that we all should take advantage, because this industry, academia, are making their contribution. We haven't put it in terms of dollars and cents, but it's got to be immense. And we got to say to those people in the budget process, look what we're doing. And you've got to come up, and you can't cut NIH. And that's my point. The question is, how else are we going to sustain this if we don't cooperate?
Thank you. We have time for about one more question. We're running a little over.
Where does the role of the academic enterprise enter into the challenge of standardization and transparency? One thinks of the same conversation could have taken place within a large-scale, complex academic enterprise with everybody wringing their hands about the fact that everybody's sitting in their own database. They don't talk to each other. They're not accessible. They've all got their own health data systems and servers in their closets. And so it strikes me that in this cultural revolution that we are proposing here, in a way, there's got to be a responsibility put on the research leadership of the academic enterprise to create a culture in which there is a support for the standardization and exchange and openness that you're talking about.
I mean, I'll let Chuck and Becky know quite a bit about that. Certainly NCI and NIH are promoted a lot of work in the CDISC environment and try and push that to the research community. Whether they're allowed to mandate it or not is a different question. So it's a good point. And I know the acronyms changed through what was the CTSA process. There was a lot of promotion of standards, particularly from the bench to bedside initiative. So it's been attempted, but I absolutely accept your point. There needs to be more effort there, and I know Chuck and Becky can.
I just have a quick comment. 30 years ago, Kaiser Health was a mediocre delivery system, but they made a commitment to health information, and it powered a revolution in the organization. And despite all the people from Harvard or Hopkins, I believe that Kaiser has better data on outcomes, preventive medicine, readmission, diabetic control, and they've done it all by reducing costs and improving quality. And I don't know a better example. It's about time we learn from it.
I'd just say it probably depends on the institution, and I'm looking at the people from Duke in the front row, and you all heard from Rob earlier, and Bob and Meredith, they're here, and they built standards into their NIH roadmap grants almost 10 years ago. And I think that's an opportunity. I also heard some NINDS people at a data sharing conference that they pulled together say, we're not going to fund these studies unless you give us data we can use. So I think it takes some sort of a commitment on their part to do that.
Okay, thank you, Becky. One more comment before we go to our
Just a
break.
comment now, before the $2.5 million is used as a standard when we get out of here. I just want to clarify a few things. That was the entire budget, including systematic reviews for about a year and a half of work. And actually Yale's under budget, so that's actually pretty good. That doesn't diminish the notion about the data, but I think we probably had the most complicated chore because we were actually looking at studies that went back to 1997, paper case report forms, very complicated, 13 different trials. So it really is, I think, an outlier example of how complicated it would be to de-identify. And I don't want that to be, I want to make sure we understand it is expensive. There's no question about that, but it wasn't $2.5 million just to de-identify.
Well, thanks to our speakers, a fabulous discussion. Great questions, so thank you.